Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today it's going to be a solo episode where I'm going to talk about the topic of discomfort and why I think it's important, why it helps us grow, and why we probably need to get into it a little more often. Now, what kicked off this whole conversation was a slew of stuff on the internet talking about the Gen Z stare. And if you're not familiar with the Gen Z stare, what this is this cultural conversation about when I, as an example, walk into a store and there's a Gen Zer in there that's working, that they will just look at me. Instead of say, hi, how are you? How can I help you? What are you looking for today? The Gen Z stare is just that. It's staring and not saying anything. And there's this discourse around a lot of people saying, this is not okay. Or if it's my store and you walk into my store and I greet you and say, hi, how are you? What can I do for you? You just stare at me and don't say anything. The people on this side of the conversation are saying that's not fine. That you need to, just say hi. And a lot of Gen Zers are standing 10 toes down, as they might say, on, hey, I don't owe anyone a conversation. I'm just in here. I don't want to talk to people. And so this is a really polarizing conversation. And for me, it started really having me question exactly how old and curmudgeon I might be, because I gotta say, I'm not okay with the Gen Z stare. And I do think that we owe each other conversations. I think there's a lot of discussion around building community and people wanting community, yet you don't even want to say hi to a store owner. I think building community requires us to be inconvenienced. Frankly, relationships require us to be inconvenienced. So if we want connection, we have to be willing to be inconvenienced or get into situations that are not totally exactly how we would want to act in that moment. We might have to get uncomfortable. Now, when we remove all these things that inconvenience us or take away from our ultimate comfort, we're missing out on the best parts of life. And so I think in this situation, it deserves a conversation around discomfort and what is good discomfort and what is bad discomfort and how should we be thinking about it. And again, these are just my opinions, so take what works for you and leave the rest. But as we get into this conversation, I would encourage you to reflect on what is your first memory of doing something uncomfortable that paid off later? Or when if you said yes to something even though you were scared? And what happened? So I think first, I'm going to just complain a little bit about what I think is problematic in the world today, in society. Again, at the risk of sounding like a grumpy old person, I think sometimes we're talking about staying comfortable, but we're disguising it as self-care. Maybe this is a hot take, but I think things like staying home when you feel anxious about a new group or an environment or an experience, not making a phone call, skipping plans, canceling on people last minute because you feel anxious about it. We can say this is self-care. I'm doing this. I'm taking care of my mental health or my emotional well-being. And like sometimes that may be true. And sometimes we might just not want to put ourselves outside of our comfort zone. So the questions I would ask you in this kind of situation are you going to feel better after doing it? Or are you going to feel worse? Or do you not know the answer to that? Because I think a lot of times there might be things that I'm not really excited about for some reason or another, where maybe I'm just feeling socially exhausted, but I always feel better afterwards. And I think it's like, working out. A lot of times I don't want to do it, but I know that it's going to be better on the other side. And I have gone through an experience where, I stopped going to things where I feel like I have to kind of perform, because I know myself well enough to know that in certain situations, certain social situations, I might turn on an energy to be something I think I need to be in a room. And I don't want to do that anymore. And it's draining. And so maybe there are times where I say no to things, but I know those things in advance. And in these cases, like I've done them and I've been to them and I didn't feel better afterwards. And so maybe there are times where I just feel like a little nervous about going to a networking event and I'm the only person that I'm going to know there. I'm going to go by myself, or into a new community. I actually am on the board of directors for a nonprofit that I went to an event by myself for the first time a couple of years ago. I ended up being on the leadership team of this organization. So there are things that on the other side are really good. And then there are things that, we might know ourselves well enough to know this particular group of people really drains me. And therefore I'm just going to say no to events where they're going to be there. I think the other thing that I'm noticing a lot of that's kind of getting me a little worked up is this idea of avoiding uncomfortable conversations. And this could be having to tell someone no. Maybe it's even writing an email to deliver bad news, avoiding a conversation, or even leaning on ChatGPT to write your email for you. And this happens all over the place. It even is something about ghosting people after a date. If you don't like someone, instead of saying, hey, I didn't see a connection there, people are just ghosting them, not talking to them, and sometimes even blocking them with no conversation. And again, the excuse that's given is like, I don't owe that person anything. And listen, sometimes it's really gross behavior that you might experience, and like that person deserved to be blocked. But like a lot of times it's just because someone didn't like the other person and they just don't want to have the difficult conversation of, I didn't see it, but I wish you the best. And so I think when it comes to this particular thing, avoiding conversations never works. Bad news does not age well. And how are we ever going to develop the muscle to have those difficult conversations, to say the things that we think might not go over well, if we're not practicing? This is one area where I don't think ChatGPT is helpful. Maybe it'll give you some thought starters or conversation starters. But ultimately, if we never actually do the thing, we're never going to build the skill to be able to do it better later. And so I think about it as, not all of my analogies are about working out, because frankly, I'm not doing it that much. But, when we're building a new muscle, it's really hard and we have to start slow. And sometimes we're going to be sore, and over time it gets easier. So as we build those new neural pathways to say, okay, last time I texted this person to tell them why I don't want to come to their event, instead of saying yes and then canceling at the last minute, it actually didn't feel as terrible as I thought it was going to. So I think when we're having uncomfortable conversations, we've got to tiptoe our way into it, but build that muscle and do it over and over again so it becomes easier. Now, the other thing I'm noticing is that people can blame this staying in a comfortable place or not having uncomfortable conversations on people pleasing. And I did a whole episode about people pleasing and the labels that we might give ourselves and why we give ourselves those labels and how we might use that as an excuse. I think some of this avoiding difficult conversations stems from people pleasing tendencies, but I think it's really important to examine what people pleasing really is, because people pleasing, by definition, is a behavioral pattern where we're prioritizing the needs and the desires of other people over our own. Now, if I am avoiding a difficult conversation, am I really people pleasing? Who am I really doing it for? Am I really putting someone else's needs before my own? I think oftentimes it's not. A lot of times it's for you, not the other person. You don't know what their needs are and you don't know how they're going to respond. And so I think a lot of times this can come from a projection of how you think someone's going to react, or maybe your own feelings of discomfort that you're experiencing and projecting onto them, thinking they're going to experience the same feelings if you tell them something that you think maybe they don't want to hear. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about two things that might be helpful. One is I really value growth and learning. In fact, growth and connection are my two core values, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about at the end. But there is a model that I really love that I think is important, and it's called the learning zone model. And really, it's pretty simple, but think about three circles. The inner circle is the comfort zone. It's where you feel safe and competent and in control, but it's also where growth tends to plateau because you're doing things that you already know how to do. Now, the next circle out is learning zone, and this is where healthy discomfort lives. You're stretching beyond what's familiar, maybe speaking up in a meeting or trying something new or having a vulnerable conversation, and you feel nervous, yes, but you're still grounded and you can breathe and you can reflect and you're at your edge and you're feeling uncomfortable. Now, the outside circle is the panic zone. Now, this is where it's too much, too fast. It's when discomfort becomes overwhelming. Now, in these panic zone situations, we might shut down, we might spiral into self-doubt, we might feel emotionally flooded. And in this zone, it's really hard to take in new information or integrate any learning because our nervous system is just trying to survive. And so here's the key. Growth happens in the learning zone, not in the panic zone. When we push ourselves too hard or too far, we are risking triggering some trauma responses that we may have had, or getting into a dysregulated state, or reinforcing a belief that doing hard things always equals harm. And so it is important to think about and know for ourselves where we really are. But growth does not happen unless you push yourself outside of the comfort zone. So how do you know what zone you're in? I think this is really where self-awareness and checking in internally with yourself becomes really crucial. Next time you're uncomfortable, try asking yourself, do I feel nervous or do I feel unsafe? Am I still breathing or am I holding my breath? Does this feel like fear of the unknown, or does this feel like panic or shutdown? And maybe think about, put yourself in a situation where you did the thing. Ask yourself, will I feel proud after this, or will I just feel relieved that it's over? I think those questions can help us tell the difference between a growth edge and maybe something that might be a little bit deeper. For me, the goal isn't to live outside of the comfort zone 24/7. It's not realistic and it's not healthy, but the goal really is to build capacity to stretch into that learning zone when it really matters, especially, and when it aligns with who you want to become. If I want to become someone who has difficult conversations, who shows up in a way that's grounded and confident, then I have to stretch myself outside of my comfort zone to start having difficult conversations. If I want to be able to speak my mind, then I have to start building that muscle. And we have to learn to trust ourselves enough to pull back when it isn't aligned with who we want to become. So discomfort can be a path to growth, but only when it's paired with kind of self-compassion and support and discernment. And that discernment gets sharper every time we check in with ourselves, see what is happening inside of our body, listen to what is happening inside of our body, and think about questioning the thoughts that you're having. Is this real, or is this just a story that I'm telling myself? Am I experiencing an emotional discomfort, or am I projecting a bunch of feelings onto a situation that aren't really factual? Now, one thing that I have done that I've really pushed myself outside of my comfort zone is around this idea of learning storytelling and working on my craft of public speaking and storytelling and keynote speaking. And it's something that I've wanted to do more of for a while now. And so a couple of years ago, I set out to get better at it. And I did a couple of things that were really scary that really helped me grow. One of them was doing a speaking intensive with an organization called fearless communicators. I actually did an episode with Eduardo Placer early on in this show, but we had to go into a room on a Saturday, and all day Saturday and all day Sunday, we're learning new skills, we're crafting our talk, and we had to then, by Thursday of that same week, 6 days later, deliver a finished talk that was about 15 minutes long, so TEDx length, about us, about something about our story. Like, we didn't even have a topic walking in. We kind of let it emerge. And I walked into this 6-day intensive knowing that it was going to be really hard and really scary and really uncomfortable, and knowing that at the end of it, I was going to be extremely proud of myself. And of course, there was fear along the way that I would get to Thursday and crash and burn, but it was something that I really wanted to do for myself, and it made me so much of a better speaker. The other thing that I've done in the last couple of years on that same note is getting up on the stage to do a talk at the Moth. And if you're familiar with the Moth, you know exactly what it is. If you're not, it's 5-minute storytelling on stage. And you don't know if you're going to get picked. You just put your name in the hat when you go to the events, and you have your story ready, and there's a theme. And I went actually on my second attempt to got on the stage and told a story. And let me tell you, that was probably the most nervous that I've ever been. I thought I was going to throw up or pass out, but I was so proud of myself when I did it. And was it perfect? Absolutely not. But it was something that I really, really value the experience in doing, and proved so much to myself that now I can do a lot of other things that are difficult, and I will be okay. Now, I do also want to talk about the idea of what is good discomfort and what is maybe harmful for us. And I think it's important just to take a step back to talk about healing and trauma and why we might get these really kind of extreme reactions to situations. I've been to therapy a number of different times in my life for various different reasons. Sometimes it was very cognitive, and I just wanted to understand something that had happened in my life or in my family. And then there are other times where, most recently, I went back to therapy last fall, about a year ago, because I was noticing that I wasn't feeling my emotions. And I knew that that was not normal. And so what I wanted to do was figure out, how do I reconnect with my emotions? What's happening? My hypothesis going in was that maybe my system had kind of shut down a little bit because I had experienced a bunch of really tough stuff last year, and it was too much and too fast. And so I was kind of in this overly stoic state, and I didn't like it, because not only was I not feeling the stress and the overwhelm of things that should have made me feel that way, but I also wasn't feeling the high highs of joyful and fun moments. And I noticed that, and I wanted to go work on it. And so I did some, somatic kind of trauma healing work around my childhood experiences. And I was having lunch a couple months later with a fellow entrepreneur friend, and she had been going through some really difficult family things. And I had mentioned how hard it has been the last couple of months, but I've been doing this work with a therapist, and it's been really helpful. And, her question to me was like, well, why? Like, why would you do it? Because, life is hard. Like, why are you making things harder on yourself by going and digging in and uprooting the past and all of these things that people can sometimes say, and reasons why they don't want to go to therapy? And for me, I think about this as like, yes, healing is hard. The analogy that I use a lot is, when we want to heal something, it's like we have a closet that's like just full of stuff, and we have to take everything out of the closet and make a huge mess. And then we have to go through everything and kind of reorganize and throw out a bunch of stuff and figure out what we want. But like, it has to get messier before it gets better. And I believe in this. I believe that it's worth it. I believe that the work is worth it. I believe that the difficulty that we have to go through to get to the other side of it is worth it. And I think for me, it's a question of, am I okay living in this state? One, it's not okay when our stuff begins to harm others or spill over or impact people in a negative way. I think that's one reason we should go do this work. And two, I think we should go do this work when it holds us back from the life that we want. For me, I was like, I want to experience my emotions. I don't want to be in this kind of frozen shutdown state. That's not okay. That's not who I am. And that's not how I want to live my life. And so for me, it was worth it to go do that work. Now, let's talk a little bit about something important when it comes to discomfort. And I think it's this idea of discernment. I'm not someone who believes that you should always push through fear or discomfort just for the sake of growth. I have done that before. I've overridden my gut. I pushed past my limits, and I've walked into situations that weren't good for me, or stayed in situations that weren't good for me emotionally, mentally, and physically. And so what I've learned is that growth isn't just about doing the hard thing. It's about knowing which hard things are worth doing, because not all discomfort is the same. And sometimes it is a sign of growing. And sometimes we push beyond discomfort and our nervous system tells us that something isn't safe. So the challenge is really learning how to tell the difference. Now, where a trauma-informed lens is helpful here is in building this discernment. And this is something that I've studied a bit, but I certainly would not say that I'm a professional practitioner in trauma by any means. But when something feels uncomfortable, I think it's worth pausing to ask, is this discomfort coming from fear of the unknown, or is it brushing up against an old wound? And our bodies do remember. And of course, like I think in general, most of these things are rooted in the past. If I'm scared to walk into a room of people that I don't know, it's probably rooted in something that has happened to me before. But even if we can't name the memory of the moment, our nervous systems may kind of perceive that threat, real or emotional, and go into these kind of survival responses like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Now, if you're in a situation where your heart is racing, your stomach drops, or maybe your brain goes foggy or you feel numb, that might be telling you that you're outside of your window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is where it's kind of this zone where we might feel challenged but still regulated. It's where we can think clearly, we can feel connected, we can make intentional choices, even sometimes when things are hard. But if you're pushing outside of that window, if you're overwhelmed or shut down, that's when discomfort stops being productive and it starts being the thing that's protecting us from something. And so really, one of the most important things that we can do to understand how to discern discomfort from a potentially harmful situation is pay attention to our bodies and this is a lot of what I did when I went back to therapy this past time, was slowing down the process and learning how to actually sense what's happening in my body and rebuild a sense of safety around some things that in the past were really, really hard and that I avoided. But now I have the tools and the wherewithal and the groundedness to handle them. It's just I needed to train my body how to feel certain things. So I know I went through a lot of stuff and I want to kind of wrap things up by just talking about how I think about this idea of discomfort in my life, or rather how I live it and I put myself in uncomfortable situations through my core values. Now, my model for talking about core values is really 3 parts, or I guess 4. And maybe I'll do a whole episode on this later if that's helpful. But at a high level, I choose a word, I define it, and then I have what I call an integration question, which is kind of when I'm in a tough situation, how can I make a choice that is aligned with my values? How do I use my values as a filter for life decisions, which really is what our values should be? And then last is the behaviors that I'm going to take on to live my values. So word, definition, integration question, and behaviors. And so this is how I've created my core values and the ones that I share with people and how I coach people around core values as well. But my core values, I have 2 of them. I mentioned before, connection and growth. And so I define connection as building and fostering healthy relationships for myself and others. This is something that is super, super, super important to me. It's a core piece of who I am and how I live my life. And the integration question that I use is, will this help me strengthen connection with the people that matter most to me? So if I'm in a situation where I'm not sure what to do, I can ask myself, will this help me strengthen connection with the people that matter most to me? And this includes having difficult conversations, bringing things up. I hold myself to a standard of how I show up in relationships and communication that I believe is a high standard. And a lot of it's because of what I do for work, but also just who I want to be. I want to be someone who can have difficult conversations and build connection on the other side of them. I want to be someone who brings stuff up with people when I'm upset about something or something isn't working for me, or we may be in a conflict situation and I want to get through it. I can think of a couple times when I've done this with friends and also, with family. There was an instance years ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10, where I had talked about something in therapy that had been really bothering me and realized that I needed to have a conversation with my brother. And I had that conversation, but it was so painfully awkward and difficult to bring up and uncomfortable to bring up because it's about stuff rooted in the past. And I didn't even know how to start the conversation, but I just forced myself to do it. And I think I know that it made our relationship significantly better because we had a different understanding of each other and how we had behaved in the past. And to me, it actually helped me let go of a lot of things I had been holding on to. So on the other side of that difficult conversation was a much better connection. And this is a person that matters to me. And I had to ask myself, is it more important to be uncomfortable or is it more important to strengthen this connection? Now, the second of my 2 values, growth. The way I define that is being a lifelong learner, experiencing new things, embracing change, and evolving. I want to use learning and experience to grow as a person. And so my integration question around this is, will this help me grow, learn, or experience something meaningful that is more important than my comfort? And that's things like learning how to be a better storyteller, but also throwing myself up on a stage to do a 5-minute talk in front of a huge audience that I had no idea how it was going to go, if I was going to black out or what. For me, it was important to build this skill. It was also important to prove to myself that I could do something like this. I get a ton of satisfaction from doing scary things and getting over the hump of that. And so that was more important to me than my comfort. And having conversations with people, building that connection is more important to me than my comfort. And progressing in life and showing people that they can build a lifestyle, a career, and all of the things that they want. And so I've thrown myself into this business of learning myself and learning about other people and learning new things and new ways to help people because it is ultimately more important to me than my comfort. So I'll wrap it up there and just say that I want you to think about what your values are, what's most important to you, and who do you want to become? And as you encounter situations where you could go left or you could go right, I want you to ask yourself, can I get uncomfortable in order to get toward the person that I want to be or the types of relationships that I want to have? All right, we'll wrap it up there.